Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I'm the president of Ubiquity University, and I want to welcome you to our monthly calls where the Chartres community comes together, both to reflect on previous visitations to that sacred site of Chartres, and in this case, to begin to prepare for our next pilgrimage, which will take place this next July, as we begin a new cycle of the liberal arts. As you know, each year for 15 years now, we have been going to Chartres. And when we discovered that 2006 was the 1000th anniversary of the founding of the Chartres Academy in 1006, we decided to commemorate that great event by each year going to Chartres the first week of July and delving into each of the liberal arts. So we've done 2 cycles of 7 liberal arts, and we finished last July with the final, in some ways, greatest liberal art, Astronomica, where we looked at the astrology of 2019, trying to understand the momentous events of that year. And as we start 2020, which all of us intuit is somehow infused with gravitas, with disruption, with momentous decision-making on the part of not only the people of the United States, but also the world about issues that are influencing us all. We thought we would start our January call with Rick Tarnas, who was the lead faculty in Astronomica, to share his thoughts and reflections on what is already in the first couple of weeks of January, a momentous year, when Trump assassinated General Soleimani of Iran, and Iran responded, and now there is an escalating tension in the Middle East. The wildfires engulfing much of Australia, news that the Arctic ice cap is now past the point of no return, Brexit now being finalized, and the separation of the UK from Europe. And at the same time, people like Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish girl who is standing clear, transparently integrous, and challenging all of us to make the decisions necessary to save ourselves from climate change. We all know that this next year is going to be definitive. And understanding this context within the planetary alignments will only deepen our understanding and therefore enhance our capacity both to navigate and to remain coherent as a community. So I want to thank you, Rick, for your willingness to be with us once again. For those of you who don't know, Rick is a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is the author of what I consider, anyway, probably the greatest book on astrology of our time, Cosmos and Psyche, which is a stupendous work showing over history how the planetary alignments have shaped human culture and human behavior. So Rick, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Jim. How's my volume okay? Can you hear me there?
Yeah.
All right, great. Welcome to everyone around the world. I'm calling from a bright gray day here in California, and you can see by contrast, it looks like Jim is in the later hours there in Amsterdam. So I imagine that a good number of you who are with us today would have heard me speak at some length about the archetypal energies and deeper forces that are at work, have been at work in these last few years when we were all together in Chartres last summer. Some of you may be new here. the basic idea here is that the cosmos is ensouled, and it's ensouled not in a kind of general way, in the sense of like an anima mundi. It's also ensouled and inspirited in a way in which there's a profound, it seems like the evidence points strongly to a kind of profound orchestrating intelligence that coordinates the overall wholeness of cosmos and psyche, of the human world and the celestial world, and it does so in such a way that there's been a many thousand-year tradition of paying close attention to the movements of the planets, the sun and the moon, and tracking how their movements seem to correlate with extraordinary archetypal expressions in human affairs, and in such a way that we can see both kind of synchronic, that is, a lot of things happening all at once across the world at in different areas of human activity, all of which reflect the same underlying archetypal gestalt, the same gods, as it were, working, playing, expressing themselves, and human beings in engagement with those archetypal powers. Out of that interaction comes history. And also we see it across history in the sense of diachronic patterns, where we see one, like let's say a conjunction of one set of outer planets, part of a long cycle of other times when the two planets came into alignment and brought forth similar historical and cultural events, experiences, phenomena, and there is an intelligible relationship between these. And this is not seen as something that is deterministic in a or mechanistic. It's not like Mars makes you angry and act out a certain way. Certainly not Mars the planet, but this seems to be more of a synchronistic, in Jung's sense, a synchronistic patterning, that everything breathes together, as Plotinus, the great philosopher, put it. All things are intercoordinated and interconnected. So with those kind of background principles in mind, let's go right to what I think many people are speaking of in the cybersphere today, and the noosphere, and that is the exact Saturn Pluto conjunction that we are in right now. I mean, this conjunction came into kind of, it was archetypally operative. We call it. It came into orb over starting as early as 2018, but 2019 and 2020 are the two most intensive years of this conjunction, and it's actually completely conjunct today. So there's been an intensification of that particular archetypal gestalt in recent days and weeks, and even more so by the fact that there was, in these last few days, the Sun and Mercury have gone right into conjunction with that Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So they're all four like lined up quite tightly. And the full moon opposite the Sun and Mercury and Saturn and Pluto, that got lined up there right at the time of the lunar eclipse. Many of you in some parts of the world may have seen it. And it's classic. When you have a full moon, that is the sun opposite the moon with the earth in between, when you have that full moon and the sun lined up right on top of a major outer planet alignment, this tends to constellate or activate the archetypal energy even more. So what is this powerful archetypal energy? Um, this is a time, Saturn is the principle of limit, of pressure, of contraction, of discipline, of uh, it can tend towards a conservative reaction, towards building walls and boundaries and defensive postures. It can be punitive. It's very judgmental. Um, uh, it also gives a capacity for dealing, building foundations and making things solid, and being very focused, concentrated, disciplined, reconnecting with important traditions, and so forth. Pluto intensifies whatever it touches. It's like the chronic elemental energies of life and death from the deep earth, from the cosmic explosion of stars and galaxies, from our own primordial instincts of the id, and it ultimately seems to have it's very much connected to the great gods and goddesses of descent and transformation, death and rebirth, Kali, Shiva, Dionysus, Hades, very definite connection to the underworld where the transformation takes place, but also where the corruption takes place. Now you put those two together, these are always periods of extraordinary urgency, gravity, historical gravity, political, economic, ecological, and moral gravitas is both required by such times and also constellated. It's very interesting that on the one hand, you get systematically. I mean, it is. For those of you who've read Cosmos and Psyche, you'll recognize there's in the 70 or 80 page section that is devoted to this Saturn Pluto cycle. It is certainly the gravest of cycles in history, where you see this is when the great contractions of history that bring about like the beginnings of wars or deep conflicts. Both world wars began under it. Vietnam War, 64 to 67, Saturn Pluto opposition. Then the very next opposition after that was in the 2001 to 2004 period, when the Iraq invasion happened, the Iraq War, and 9/11 happened, the invasion of attack on Afghanistan from the United States, and a setting in motion of crises centered in the Middle East and emanating from beyond that we are still living with, and now the crisis between the United States and Iran, and like clockwork, these are periods when Israel and their neighbors tend to get in, and Israel and Palestine come into a greater conflict. I mean, starting with the first Saturn-Pluto conjunction of Israel and Palestine's modern existence when they are formed in 1948, and then the Yom Kippur War, the 6 Days War, the invasion of Lebanon in '82. I mean, it's just like clockwork. And there tends to be periods of great conservative empowerment across the world, more authoritarian governments and policies, xenophobic efforts at control of borders and suppression of immigrants and things like that. These are all very, these are dark shadow side effect or expressions of this Saturn-Pluto complex. Nature can become nature, the plutonic powers, the elemental energies can become more severe in their relationship to the human species and vice versa. But Saturn-Pluto is also the aspect of that. You see it in many of the people who, facing the shadow, facing the burdens of history, facing the corruption in the human soul on the collective level, as well as within one's own individual life, a kind of moral courage and can be forged under such circumstances that rises to the occasion and turns this kind of relentless contraction of history and psyche into essentially a birth contraction. At some deep level, there is no difference between a death contraction and a birth contraction. They are the same. In fact, that seems to be part of the death rebirth mystery that many people experience in the depths of the transformational crucible of initiatory perinatal experiences, rites of passage, is that in the very experience of facing the darkest aspects of existence and of experiencing the contractions and even the dying to the death in so many forms, those contractions turn out to be the necessary contractions that bring forth a new life. The loss of the womb, the expulsion from the garden of paradise, the terrible separation from the old unity of being turns out to be the necessary transformational crucible within which a new being, a new life, a new mode of life emerges. And people have very vivid experiences of this under Saturn-Pluto aspects, as a matter of fact. It's not for nothing that both Carl Gustav Jung and Stan Grof, the two modern psychologists who perhaps most engaged the shadow, Jung himself coined that term for that purpose, who really faced the most harsh and cruel sides of life within their own depths, and helping others to face those shadows and to face the the experience of death and dying in so many different ways, that they both were born with Saturn and Pluto in hard aspect. And you see it with people like, take Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks in December 1955, meeting the cruel oppression of racism in the South, and beginning the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks refusing to get up from the back from her seat at the front of the bus, and Martin Luther King, such a young man, just joining and taking on the leadership, even though he himself and his children and family are being threatened. The courage to have done that. And it's also, and that was a Saturn-Pluto square exactly that was going on at that time. You're facing it's times of facing great moral challenges, often facing even something that feels like evil. And I think deep down, we all have that sense that today so much of the world and of the a certain political psychic force that is informing the leadership in the United States, in Russia, in China, in Brazil, in Turkey, Syria. One could name many other places around the world, is in the grip of something that feels like a dark force, a possession state. It's a kind of evil possession state. And where active efforts are being made to actually accelerate the loss of species and the protection of the earth and the effective dealing with climate change and the treatment of immigrants, where you have things like concentration camp cages of for immigrant children who are being separated from their parents. This kind of behavior is an expression of the shadow side of the Saturn Pluto complex, and yet witnessing it, facing it, taking on the moral challenge of opposing it. That's also part of this same complex. The solution to the negative dimensions of an archetypal gestalt are within that gestalt. The archetypes carry both sides of it. And you see it with Greta Thunberg. She's born under the last Saturn. She's so young, she's born under the Saturn-Pluto opposition that coincided with 9/11 and with the Iraq War, and with the tremendous intensification at that time of the awareness of the climate crisis and the mass extinction of species. Under that 2001 to 2004 period, there was a tremendous increase in consciousness of that global crisis that has been getting more and more accelerated in our lifetimes. Well, she is born with that, and notice that kind of gravitas with which she carries herself, the integrity that Jim talked about, that moral integrity, that solidity of purpose and groundedness. Those are all Saturn Pluto qualities, and in many ways she represents a great model for us all, and certainly an inspiring counterpoint to a certain president in another part of the world that her very integrity seems to bother intensely, as we see when Trump he couldn't stand that she was named the person of the year by Time magazine rather than himself. What an ego! That the pathology is mind-boggling. So keep in mind now that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of particularly strong this year and happening overall between 2018 to 21, though that's the larger orb, 15 degree of the conjunction, that is taking place at the end of this long Uranus-Pluto square that's been going on all through from 2007 through the 2010s, all the way to the present, and that's just starting to get towards the end. But when you get towards the end of these big world transits, the entire world psyche, as it were, the collective field, the zeitgeist, is so saturated with the energies that have been carried forward during this Uranus-Pluto period, that in many ways it's extremely strong, even though it's starting to move towards the end of its mathematically calculated orb. Around 2020, it's now this year, it begins to move permanently past the 10 degree orb of a square, but it is still going to be we get something called the sunset phenomenon towards the end, where it's just really saturating the colors of the system, so to speak. And we can expect to see the characteristic Uranus-Pluto qualities of tremendous impulse towards change and reform, acceleration of history, technological advance at a very rapid pace, but also the danger of technology becoming a power in itself. Tremendous turmoil, people in the streets, rebellions, revolts, demonstrations, protests. There are more protests in this last year than there were at the beginning of the period. Although, if we stand back, we can just see how much this was like the 1960s and the 1930s, the other two periods that had Uranus and Pluto in hard aspect alignment. The conjunction of the 60s, 60 to 72, or the square from 1928 to 37. Mass movements of energies, the eruption of the impulse for change, populism, socialism, but also tendencies towards fascism, mob energy, a kind of wild activation of the collective id that demagogic leaders can tap into. And so, but at the same time, all the progressive impulses that tend to get activated, as we saw during the 1960s, have been very active in this last decade, the last 12 years. We see it in the Occupy movements. We see it in the Arab Spring. We see it in the tremendous increase in awareness of young people in taking an active role in political, ecological transformation. So the empowerment of women, which is systematically correlated with the Uranus-Pluto period, going back to Mary Wollstonecraft in the French Revolutionary period and the vindication of the rights of women, and then the next conjunction, 1848, with the Seneca Falls Convention and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucy Mott and so forth, and then going right up to the present period, where we had the great women's marches, not only in the US, like right 3 years ago, right after the Trump inauguration, that's huge, but in many other countries, women's marches have been extraordinary, in Italy, in Israel, in women's empowerment in the Middle East, in Persia, in or Iran, in even Saudi Arabia, perhaps the most theocratically suppressed state of in the world. The empowerment of women has been a very major theme under this Uranus-Pluto period. Let me just finish with, some people may have a question or comment after this, but let me just throw in one last thing. It's sometimes very useful to listen to music or watch films, read literature that reflects the Saturn-Pluto energy, the key figures and the people who wrote the music or performed it or who made the films were born with the Saturn-Pluto energy, or these works of art were themselves born under previous Saturn-Pluto periods, and it can be helpful to my philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program at CIS asked me for suggestions for iconic works of art and music in particular, just to listen to under this period, because everybody felt the pressure. Everybody felt the sense of dire gravity and urgency that has been going on in the last, in more than ever in the last few weeks. And so I suggested, well, right away, take something like that song, Under Pressure, by David Bowie and Queen. Both David Bowie and Freddie Mercury were born with a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, 1946-47, and then they create and produce the film, the song Under Pressure, under the very next conjunction of 1981-84, and the lyrics completely capture that sense of things are under pressure. And that's what's, see, Saturn is contraction, it's pressure, it's limits, but Pluto is driving it. That's the pressure of birth, as well as the pressure of relentless, the sense of relentless labor and tension, stress that so many feel. And then, of course, we're now under the next conjunction, so you can see that kind of diachronic pattern and why that song Under Pressure is so good. But so many of the songs that came out under the Saturn-Pluto opposition in, let's say, the mid-60s, when they were opposite, and you've got things like a Rolling Stone with Bob Dylan, or Painted Black and by the Stones, or Can't Get No Satisfaction, or Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. How does that, that sense of the hour is getting late, let us not talk falsely now. All along the watchtower, princes kept the view. All of us are keeping the view. All of us are watching. A sense of the howls of the wolves are beginning to howl. That sense of almost Tolkien-like historical gravitas, and songs like "The End" by The Doors, and great films. If you see many of the great films of Saturn-Pluto directors like Oliver Stone or Alfred Hitchcock or Orson Welles, they were all born with the Saturn-Pluto and hard aspect, and they really carry that in one film after another. And maybe I'll just end with that. There's a beautiful passage I reread last summer for the first time in 50 years, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. I was reading it because my daughter Becca did a doctoral dissertation on Jung's Red Book and Tolkien's Red Book, of which Lord of the Rings is kind of outcome of it. And they both had the same kind of visionary descent right during World War I period, 1913-14 through the 19-teens, that basically gave birth to their vision and what they brought to the world. And and in order to be competent enough to read my Becca's dissertation, I reread Tolkien, and I was really compelled by and awakened anew, in a sense, to what an extraordinary. I mean, he not only had a narrative gift, but he had and this capacity to create an entire world, but he had a profound moral vision and a historical vision. He's a kind of moral philosopher that pervades the entire epic work. But there's a crucial line where Frodo and Gandalf being the classic Senex wise figure, wise old man archetype, as Jung put it, they're discussing the rise of darkly threatening forces and the empowerment of evil that is now threatening the peaceful life of the Shire. And Frodo says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. And Gandalf replies, so do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. I think this captures exactly none of us particularly are jumping up and down with excitement about having to face such an apocalyptically intense period when so much is at stake and so much and so many truly destructive forces have authority, have power, and things often seem to be going in the exact wrong direction. That is not ours to choose. That this time we are here, perhaps at some higher level before we were born, at some other bardo, we have spiritually chosen this period to come and do our work. But within the consciousness most of us live in, we find ourselves here. We're thrown here, as the existentialists would say, and we're thrown into this situation. And now our existential obligation and privilege is to meet this time with all the moral courage and intelligence and imagination and compassion that we can. So I hope these few words, I didn't cover the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction that's going to be happening during this year, which will bring in another inflection of often very helpful energy. The Saturn moving into a square to Uranus little midway through the spring will bring in even more dialectics, dynamics between the old and the new. But let me just leave it with what I've said, and hope that it will be useful to you in your lives today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. And we have a little bit, maybe 10 minutes for any questions or comments that anybody wants to make. I noted that Jean Houston has joined us, and Anne Baring. I want to offer a special Happy New Year's and welcome to you. We'd appreciate any comments that you would like to make. As we wait for someone.
Excuse me. Hi. Let me just say hi, Jean. Hi, Anne. I don't get to see you every day. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Anne's joined us over the last couple of years, and Jean has joined us once every 7 years for Rhetorica, where we study the power of language. No one uses language and oratory better than Jean Houston. But as you can just click on your, raise your little hand at the lower part of your screen if you want to make a comment. But I just want to make one segue. It's in the spirit of the Saturn Pluto and the conjunction and alignments with Jupiter that we chose the meta theme for Grammatica. Grammatica is about the word and the words that really characterize our planetary reality, our national realities, our cultural, political, financial, personal realities is trauma. I don't know of a word that is more pervasive in the world today. And the other word is transformation. How do we, within the context of everything Rick is laying out is in store, of deepening gravitas, corruption, chthonic upheaval, how do we use that energy for transformation, for coherence, for the strength of a community simply to stand, and in standing to embody those virtues of a Rosa Parks, of a Greta Thunberg, of all the people around the world who are standing tall against, in many cases, a deepening darkness. So we hold these monthly calls in the spirit of coherence, so that as we traverse these very delicate and volatile times, we can use that energy in a way that empowers and illuminates not only ourselves, but others. So if people want to really go deeper, Grammatica this next July is going to be about all the issues that Rick has been discussing. I see that Jean has raised her hand. Jean, welcome. Georg, if you can put her on. I don't know whether you're on video, Jean, or on the phone, but welcome, and we would appreciate your comments. Hello.
There, good friend. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good, good. Well, Rick, I do have a very important question. You have spoken so brilliantly and trenchantly about the apocalyptic powers of this particular conjunction we find ourselves in. At the same time, at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about how the powers of dying and apocalypse are countered by the powers of new life, new ways of being. But I did not hear you address what those are. I myself feel it has to do with the rise of the feminine in our time. I have a life in which I travel all over the world a lot of the time, and everywhere I go, I find that there is the rising feminine to counter, let's say, the dying of the forms of the old patriarchy. Is this part of the positive charge within
Yes.
this period? I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Sure. Hi, Jean. And in fact, I did mention exactly that sense of the tremendous empowerment of women in our time as part of a long lineage of kind of cyclical activations of the power of the feminine over these, whether it's going back to the Wollstonecraft in the French Revolutionary period, or the women's suffrage, and then the great feminist movements of the 1960s, and then again in our own time, as you say, across the world and in so many different dimensions. I mean, yes, on the streets, but also in the congresses and in the community organizing and so forth, and leadership positions. At an archetypal level, I think this connects very deeply to the power of the feminine archetype, because at a deep level, see, Saturn Pluto is both embodied in patriarchy, that combination of power, Pluto, and Saturn, the strict father, the patrilineal, and the rigidity of it, the oppressiveness of it, the structural solidity of it, etc. All that's patriarchal thing is connected to Saturn Pluto. But Saturn Pluto is also the energy of the great mother goddess giving birth, and in every mother who gives birth, and in any of us who mobilize tremendous forces of stamina and courage. And you think of a mother in childbirth, the absolute kind of seriousness of the contraction. See, the Saturn is the contraction, but Pluto is the tremendous elemental propulsion, the biological energy that is driving the birth. And in the death rebirth experience, there is an extraordinary kind of mystical transformation where one moves from the sense of a no exit contraction to suddenly realizing and discovering that the contraction is giving birth. And at that point, the power of the feminine principle suddenly reveals itself on a whole nother level. And in some ways you get, well, the basic idea that I think patriarchy is kind of like the 5,000-year birth canal of the great mother goddess. So that's some of how, it's going to take everybody to pull off this transformation. but there's no question that this is the time of women on every level, and a lot of us are doing all we can to support that.
Thank you.
And what we're doing on that theme in August is Madonna Rising in Chartres, around the Feast of the Assumption of Mary, exploring and embodying what is this rise about, not only helping the rise of the feminine in the world, but in each and every one of us, in becoming the rising feminine and what that means. We'll be exploring the teachings of Mary Magdalene, exploring the cathedral as as a grail, an initiatory process into living the message of the feminine that comes into balance with the masculine and births this union. So that's
Banafsheh, could I add something about what you yourself embodied this past summer
Sure.
on this very point, because it was really one of the most moving, almost really archetypal moments in last summer at the Astronomica week in Chartres, and that is here, right there in Chartres Cathedral, where to a certain extent there'd been a patriarchal limitation on what could be done in the labyrinth. And we all did the labyrinth that one night. And then as the last people completed their journey, you in the center moved from, you'd been kind of stationary and almost kind of concealed, and then you kind of rose and then began to do your graceful dance right at the heart of the labyrinth. And it really was just like, I don't know, it was numinous. A lot of us felt the numinosity, and it was a sense of like the feminine principle through dance, through the body, through Mary and Mary Magdalene, and it was just all right there in the cathedral, which is itself this kind of amniotic womb to the great goddess of Christianity, as Charlene Stretnack calls Mary. Anyway, you did a beautiful, beautiful job, and it was more than a performance. It was an archetypal event.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rick. And exactly, to do it within the constraints of the patriarchal system, it was quite challenging, but I actually had no choice. It was sort of a role given to me from I don't know where, and I just had to respond to the occasion and rise up.
And the authorities invited you to do it too, which is what was quite remarkable.
Some of the authorities.
Well, the main authority, the director of ritual, who's been the director of ritual for 15 years, for exactly as long as we've been going to Chartres, spotted Banafsheh and understood intuitively and numinously that she was there to take the energetic qualities of the labyrinth to the next level by, in fact, exactly as Rick just stated, to blow through the restrictions of the patriarchy that had been suppressing and making horizontal the labyrinthian energy. And for her to just go up like that, almost being elevated off the floors of the cathedral, was an extraordinarily powerful event. And we're going to be continuing both at Chromatica and at Madonna Rising this new ritual form, in part because of its numinous and potentially historic power. So Banafsheh, thank you for your courage. And I just noted in the chats that Amy and Heidi have also noted that Harriet Tubman, there's a movie out called Harriet, Harriet Tubman during the Civil War was, you know, in the spirit of Rosa Parks and Greta Thunberg and Banafsheh and Jean and Anne and all the great women stood up and saved lives simply because she was compelled to do really the obvious. And so when we go to Grammatica and we delve into trauma and transformation, and we go into Madonna rising and celebrate the emergence and transformative power of the feminine, our Chartres Academy and Wisdom School are just trying to bring us together around seminal issues that are not only historically important, as Rick is laying out for us, but personally important for our capacity simply to navigate the turbulence that is coming as these forces and planetary alignments collide. So thank you, Rick. Are there any others that want to ask a question or comment before we move on? Anne, do you want to make any comment? We'd love to hear from you. You know, as we're, there we go.
Hi, Anne.
There we are. Yeah, I just want to say that looking back over the last 50 years, at the end of the war, one could do very little unless you were actually involved in rescuing Germany or restarting Europe, so to speak. But there's been a progressive ability to act, which coming through the feminist movement, which is accelerating quite definitely now. And we've got to the point where we can see clearly how awful everything is. And we can see clearly that we have to change, or everything has to change. That clarity wasn't here before. I think it's come in only in the last 2 or 3 years almost. And Greta Thunberg is really personifying that clarity. Her voice is really speaking for it, I think. Also, I think we're guided. I definitely feel definitely something coming much closer to guiding us and telling us when to act, what to do, what to say. Even words coming into my mind in the middle of the night. It's very powerful, and that people are with us from the other side. So that's all I'd like to say, that we have to trust the process, which is accelerating, getting stronger and darker. But the darker it gets, the stronger the light gets as well. Okay.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you.
Yeah,
I really appreciate Anne's absolutely important reminder to all of us that as we deal with the concrete crisis before us day to day in our world here, there's also a lot going on below the surface, and there are beings and forces and spiritual realities that are at work here beyond our ken, and that often play crucial roles in our own insights, our own capacity to act in certain ways in a timely way, and so forth. So Anne's reminder of how we are embedded in a larger matrix of divinity and grace is so crucial. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, and that's a good note with which to close our call. You know, as we traverse our lives, we tend to think that we're atoms in a sea of chaos, and we're not sure what the connections are, how to connect the dots, and really to understand what's even happening. And I think we're in one of those times. But as Anne says, that's where I think the power of faith, you know, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of which is not seen, really comes into play, and understanding that in some deep level, we're all connected. We're connected to each other. We're connected to the planetary ecology. We're connected to the planetary movements in our solar system. Our solar system is connected to the Milky Way, and every aspect, every infinitesimal small part of everything that is, all breathes together, as Rick said earlier, Plotinus said 2,000 years ago. And in that breathing together, as Martin Luther King said, there's an arc to the universe, and the arc bends toward justice, even though we can't see it in our lifetime. And so I want to thank you, Rick, for gracing us again with your wisdom about the deeper archetypal layers of what's happening at the level of our relationship with the planet. I want to just focus us on what's coming up again with Grammatica, and then we have a pilgrimage down to the caves of the Dordogne to really go into the primordial. That's the mother lode, that's the mother goddess. That is the origins of human aesthetic consciousness as far as we know. Those ancient cave art configurations. Then in August with Madonna Rising, as Banafsheh said, and then also a pilgrimage to the sites in France associated with Mary Magdalene. And we chose Mary Magdalene because in the spirit, Jean, of your very important point of the rise of women being so seminal in our time, it turns out that it was Mary Magdalene who was seminal to the life and ministry of Jesus. It was not the 12 disciples. It was his deep love with Mary, and Mary's deep understanding of who he was and why he was born to be. And that she was, in fact, the translator of the mystical knowledge of Jesus to the 12 disciples and to the early church. But then, as with many women, was suppressed and evaporated in history, only to reside in those arcane nooks and corners of memory in the mystical communities. And with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts about 50 years ago in Egypt, all of a sudden, Mary Magdalene's grandeur has decade by decade grown, and we want to celebrate her and empower this feminine impulse in every way we can. And so it's in that spirit of transformation that I want to thank you. And also, if you want to sign up in the next a week or two, and by the middle of February, you get a discount if you take 2 of the courses. Many people want to do so. So we want to welcome all of you to once again join us in Chartres this next year. And thank you all for this very robust call. Rick, thank you. You're very good at what you do.
Well, thanks. It was a small effort, but anyway, thank you.
And now I'll turn it over to Banafsheh to give us a benediction. Banafsheh.
Thank you. I want to thank Rick also for this, for illuminating so much for us. And I want to end with the quote that Rick also used from Tolkien, with the time that is given to us. With the time that is given to us, I would like to add, may we harness the potent energy of the time, of this time, to resolutely cultivate courageous peace in ourselves and with the people around us in each and every interaction. So the actions we take to establish coherence and peace on the larger world scale are true and based in integrity, a simultaneous moving in and moving out. I close our gathering in the name of the birth of living love. Until next month, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in a month's time. Bye-bye.
Bye.